Rabbi Greg Epstein is a humanist rabbi. He has served this country's rapidly growing population of non-religious people for nearly 2 decades. Described as the godfather to the humanist movement by the New York Times Magazine, in recognition of his efforts, Epstein was also named one of the top faith and moral leaders in the United States by Faithful Internet. Greg currently serves as the humanist chaplain at Harvard University, a position he has held since 2005. He joined MIT's Office of Religious Life as a humanist chaplain and a convener, just now in 2018. Greg has helped establish similar positions at Yale, Stanford, USC, and other academic institutions. Greg has also served in an advisory capacity for a diverse range of interfaith and humanistic institutions, including Boston Mayor Martin Walsh's Interfaith Advisory Task Force and the advisory board of the Secular Student Alliance. He also supported the Inclusive America Project, an initiative of the Aspen Institute co-chaired by the former Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. He has served for nearly a decade on the Harvard Chaplains Executive Committee with a term as vice president. His writings have appeared on CNN, The Washington Post, Newsweek, Forbes, Salon, and more. His work has also been widely discussed in the national and international media, including the New York Times, CNN, Boston Globe, and dozens of radio and television programs. Over the years, he had led and facilitated thousands of humanist and interfaith programs and educational opportunities at Harvard and elsewhere, universities, community and state colleges, urban public and private high schools, at the United States Congress and Senate, megachurches, synagogues, and Islamic centers, and interfaith and civic institutions of many other kinds. So, what's he doing here? Having first discovered humanism through Rabbi Sherwin Wine and the SHJ rabbinic program, as a recent college graduate in the year 2000, Greg considers himself to have been deeply influenced by Wine, to whom he dedicated his book, Good Without God. After over 5 years of intense study, including a year and a half in Israel, in Tmura, supported by fellowships from Harvard and the University of Michigan, Greg was ordained as a humanist rabbi right here in October 2005. He is deeply proud, so we're told, and humbled to be the keynote speaker of this important gathering, and especially now that he is a father. He looks forward to helping advance the cause of humanistic Judaism for a new generation. Well, as I told you, Greg authored the New York Times best-selling book, Good Without God, What a Billion Non-Religious People Do Believe. So you should know who is Greg. He is the man who desires life, who loves all his days, to see and to do good, and to see it in you. Please welcome my dear friend, my colleague, with much love and appreciation, to give his keynote speech. Relax and listen. Enjoy.
Thank you, Sivan. I love you. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, Paul, for all of your effort, and Miriam for all of your effort to make this possible. Yeah. All right, I got it. Don't worry, if you're having trouble hearing me, just let me know. I don't think you'll have trouble hearing me. I'm also still moved by Jared or Dr. Marisco or Zamir. Where are you? You have heart, my friend. I've never met you before, but that was beautiful. And thank you all for this honor of being the keynote speaker at this wonderful gathering. Wow, thank you. Of course, I was not around for the founding of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. I was -8 years old back then, and you know, time flies, especially those negative years. But for me, it was nearly 19 years ago, the spring of 2000, that I first entered this building, and I was unaware that I was about to have my life completely transformed by the singular work taking place here. Now, I don't know if it's ever been spoken of the SHJ having a golden age, or if it's even consistent with humanism to think of it that way, and it's probably not. But at the time when I arrived here, as a scruffy post-adolescent, and I was probably wearing a bright red polyester shirt with a big collar, tight bell-bottom jeans, and Union Jack boots, by the way. Well, that era, my wardrobe aside, would be a great candidate for the golden age distinction of SHJ, if there was any. This building had long been fully constructed and looked great, as it absolutely does today. Sherwin Wine was sitting at the head of what we then, I guess, just called the picnic room, and he was ramrod straight in his chair, and he was teaching. He was agelessly paternal, at least to me, seemingly at the peak of his powers in his 70s. Then there was the great Marilyn Rowan's, now my favorite semi-retired philosophical cartoonist, who was the ISHJ executive director. And then there were my extraordinary rabbinic classmates. I am so grateful for the year that I got to spend studying alongside Miriam and Adam and Ben Biber. Ben was a teaching fellow of mine. He had been for a U of M religion course, from which I dropped out. Probably he was the one who first spoke the word humanism to me. And he invited me here, and the rest is my history. I don't know if Ben or Miriam or Adam, where's Adam, around somewhere, I don't know if they realize fully, you're each my heroes. You were so cool back then. I mean, maybe not in the, shredded jeans and even more shredded abs, kind of cool, right? Not that sense of the word cool, but you were so smart, thoughtful, wise, Jewish, humanistic, everything I immediately realized that I wanted to be, and you still are. And those three graduated, and then I got to study alongside Eva Goldfinger for the next 4 years, ultimately getting ordained alongside Eva. And that's like if the kids from Dead Poets Society graduated and then immediately joined Robin Williams' character, whatever his name was, on the English faculty of their school. I mean, Eva wrote the first humanist book I ever read. So this is it. This is your book. This is my very, very folded up and marked up copy of your book, Eva. My book was meant to introduce people for the first time to humanism, and that's what yours did for me. I still use your turns of phrase, no single overarching purpose to life. I've uttered that combination of words about 5,000 times now. And then there was the year and a half that I got to spend in Israel studying under Sivan. I could talk about Sivan all day. The short version is, that's my rabbi. My rabbi, yeah. Joining her first rabbinic class and making lifelong friends thanks to their unbelievable support for my utter refusal to speak to them in English. Had to learn Hebrew somehow. In short, this movement has provided the best educational and communal experiences of my life. And it isn't particularly close. We're all celebrating this weekend because for 50 years, our teachers and our community leaders and the lessons they've taught have been truly world-class. World-class. For my money, there's nothing better, Harvard very much included. I love everything this movement has been for the past 50 years, and I love it today. And with the talented new leaders we've seen this week, the new golden age could be right now. The goldener age. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. All right. Good, good. I'm glad you applauded that line. It's very important that you do so. Because now I have my sincere and heartfelt loyalty on the record. Because let's be direct, you invited me here to speak. So what am I going to speak about? I'm going to talk about how the movement needs to change. First, I'm going to tell you why I've been thinking lately about the need for change. My entire career I've been thinking about it, and especially lately, and I don't mean just change for SHJ, but in general. Then I'm going to tell you about some of what I've learned about change and religion/humanism through my new current work on the ethics of technology and how that work came to exist in the first place. And then finally, I'll talk about some possible lessons and maybe even a couple of paths forward for the next 50 years of SHJ. But first, as I was saying, this movement, which I love, needs to change. Now that sounds like an insult, doesn't it? It feels inappropriate, like bringing a skunk as your date to the birthday party, to even utter it in this context. And my wife could tell you what that's like, bringing a skunk to the birthday party. I mean, in fact, correct me if I'm wrong here. Hold on. Change, though, is not a bad thing, right? I want to clarify that. Correct me if I'm wrong, right? But I seem to recall something about how humanists believe that evolution is a fact of life. Could you, right? Something about that? And don't get me started, or any of the history teachers in the room started, on change throughout Jewish history. I mean, has there ever been a successful stream of Jewish life that did not continually evolve with changing times, not to mention changing technologies? Hello? But again, before I get to the topic of changing technologies, let me share a little bit about how I've changed personally. After my first one-on-one meeting with Sherwin, he apparently asked Miriam about me. Do you think he's stable? Thankfully, I believe Miriam answered, he's 23, how stable do you want him to be? Back then, I was known, I think, as something of, and this is not complimentarily, something of an evangelical humanist. This was not necessarily because of my message or my ideas, though I was certainly, and still am, a passionate believer in the importance of a middle way between traditional religion and aggressive anti-religiosity. I think the main reason I got called an evangelical was my personal style. I'm in some ways a typical New Yorker. Which means that I've always been a loud talker. On the other hand, I grew up as the only white, blonde, American-born boy in my almost impossibly multicultural class, as multicultural as a group of 30-something kids could be. And then I was lucky enough to become captain and president of a national champion speech and debate team, and we routinely traveled to the South and the Midwest for oratory tournaments. And this partly explains why I think my stylistic influences were less Woody Allen or Jerry Seinfeld and a little bit more maybe Bill Clinton with a hint of agnostic Billy Graham or maybe occasionally an atheist Jimmy Swaggart. I want you to pursue personal fulfillment. And I need you to change the world, but not in the name of Jesus. No, I want you to change the world in the name of Marvel Comics or the Beat Poets or maybe, I don't know, Goldman Sachs. I haven't really thought this all the way through. My mother said I'd one day be the first Jewish televangelist. And, you know, in some ways you weren't far off. And now, with that early history, you can get a brief summary. This will be inspired by 60-second Shakespeare, if you've ever heard of that lovely literary genre, and those who can't, you can imagine it. Summary of the changes in my life since then. Went to Michigan, formed a poetry festival and a rock band, quit both of those, majored in Chinese, stopped studying Chinese, discovered SHJ, learned the absolute basics of Hebrew and Jewish history, while also hanging around many of this in this illustrious gang. A few years later, took graduate courses in Talmudic literature at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where the lectures, texts, and written exams were all in Hebrew and Aramaic. Then I made my way to Harvard, where I soon dropped my Hebrew studies almost entirely after becoming Harvard's second humanist chaplain when my predecessor retired early, unexpectedly, after 30 years. Then I talked about simultaneously launching an SHJ congregation, but didn't. And then I wrote a book introducing humanism to a relatively wide audience, including via a well-publicized series of billboards on the New York City and Boston subways and buses, and highways, and near Major League Baseball stadiums and wherever else they put them. I don't remember. Anyway, and then we spent nearly a decade building multicultural, godless congregations. And then I got vetted by the FBI and White House legal team for 6 months, 6 freaking months. Coming this close to being the first ever official representative for humanism to the Obama administration, and that meant this close to being a Ted Cruz speech. I'd say more, but I'm really worried that I'll get like a dart in my neck for even revealing that much, because it's pretty much considered confidential. And if that doesn't sound like enough change to you, since I joined MIT last year, in addition to still being at Harvard, I've given up on my congregation building work entirely. And I've refocused most of my work on the ethics of technology. Look, I feel actually vulnerable listing all these changes for you. I mean, actually, up here, I wasn't so much vulnerable as embarrassed that I actually wrote this bullet point list and made it an assignment for myself to deliver it to you. But, you know, part of me honestly does feel like a failure for having tried so many different things over the years rather than having stayed the course in one or two. But I recount them all because change is necessary. Change is necessary in this movement, in our individual lives and careers, and certainly in a world where too much is presently off course for us to even consider staying the course. And so one thing that you might get out of my talk tonight, if nothing else, is to think about what needs to change in my life, you might think. What needs to end so that something new in my life can begin. So, you know how this movement has many sophisticated philosophers as role models? I guess what I'm really saying is, sometimes we could use just a little bit more Madonna as a role model. And not Jesus' mother, by the way, I mean Madonna Louise Veronica Ciccone, born in Bay City, Michigan, that iconoclastic Catholic theologian with her provocative doctrine on virginity and prayer, about whom Billboard magazine once wrote, "No pop diva has reinvented her image with the consistency and creativity of Madonna. She's the patron saint of change." Okay, so, all right, Madonna fan, what kind of change exactly does the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and perhaps humanism more broadly, need? Well, for me, the answer begins, at least, or this chapter of the answer begins with technology. These days, I spend most of my time thinking about how technology is a lot like religion. Maybe even the biggest religion ever invented. Oi, Gewalt, Moshe, is this Meshuggah Pisher saying we need to preach the gospel of tech? No. We don't need yet another lecture on the need for, better websites or podcasts or social media presence. No. Yeah, all of those are important, but actually, thanks to new leaders like Paul Golan and Rabbi Denise Handlarsky, and Israeli leaders like my friends Rabbis Nardi Grun and Oren Yehi Shalom, we're actually much stronger on those aspects of what we do these days. And besides, in the year 2019, the world in many ways needs less of the electronic media, not more. If anything, the tech world needs what we do as a movement, what we do best. It needs our skepticism. It needs our critical thinking. It needs our intellectual humility and our humanistic compassion for all. We've got to export that into the tech world. Unfortunately, most of us in the humanist movement more broadly, and really myself included, up until recently or today or whatever, we're still preaching our gospel of humanist community, metaphorically speaking, inside abandoned churches, synagogues, and temples of old. We don't understand that those metaphorical structures are empty. Where did all the people go, we ask? Why aren't they listening, we ask? To extend this metaphor, they're not listening because they're gone. They've not only left their houses of worship, they've skipped the town entirely. They've headed west, you could say. And so while we talk about how humanist philosophy is an alternative to traditional religion, so many of the people we think of as our target market, the millions and millions of non-religious people identified by surveys and demographic studies, most of them aren't humanists. And the reason for their lack of affiliation with organizations like ours is not just because we haven't reached them, or because our websites aren't cool enough, or even because we don't offer enough programs and services. And I feel like I have some standing to say this, actually, because, for years I was the executive director and clergy for a humanist congregation. We worked our butt off, and we did reach thousands of young people. We did bring them in. We did have a website and a brand that was cool enough to attract some rock stars and movie stars to participate. We raised money in the 7 figures for that congregation. We hired a lot of young staffers, and we put on 1,000 well-attended programs over the course of a 5-year period. It wasn't enough. It was not enough. This year, my board and I decided to shut that congregation down and go back to being, as a nonprofit organization, mainly a university chaplaincy, now serving the campuses of Harvard and MIT, because it wasn't enough. And that's okay. The main reason I decided it wasn't enough is because for so many of the people we talk about recruiting or wish we could recruit, they say, we say they're not religious. But that isn't true. They are religious, often very much so. They just don't realize it, and neither do we, because they're members of a religion clever enough not to conceive of itself as such, even though that's essentially what it is. They're followers of the religion of technology. Now, what do I mean by the religion of technology? Okay, in the summer of '92, around the time that Bill Clinton, then a relatively unknown young governor of Arkansas, overcame a crowded field to win the Democratic nomination for president, the legendary tech and media critic Neil Postman published a book called Technopoly, in which he argued Americans had largely replaced religion and spirituality with a faith in technology. Postman, a Jewish humanist from Flushing, Queens, New York City, like me, but 46 years earlier, and he had much better hair, I admit, had attained legendary status in part for his 1985 book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, in which Postman argued that the future would be less like what Orwell envisioned in 1984 and more like what Aldous Huxley imagined in A Brave New World. So in other words, civilization won't fall because of a fascist boot stomping on the human face forever, Postman warned, but because thanks to television and all the media technologies to follow it, we will end up amusing ourselves to death. Now, obviously, we live in the era of the first reality TV president, elected because Russian hackers were able to take advantage of our country's obsession with social media. And seemingly every time a serious news journalist gets laid off, a new TV channel or social media site gets its wings. So it's getting harder and harder to argue against amusing ourselves to death's thesis. Most of the best books about tech these days still reference Neil Postman in their opening chapter. And in Postman's 1992 book, his last for a broad audience, he warned the United States of America was the first technopoly, a place where more than any other culture in the history of humanity, an entire population had embraced and dedicated itself fully to technology, and in which the people themselves were redefining themselves by it. Of course, he then went on to talk about how he was constantly receiving faxes and how the fax machine promised to revive the art of letter writing. So, he didn't get everything right, okay? But was he right about the big picture? In my intro to religion class as a Michigan freshman, I loved it so much it headed me down this path. Ralph Williams, Brian Schmidt, SHJ faculty, we were taught to compare religions based not only on their theological elements, but on the structural elements of the religion. So sacred texts, sacred space, time, people, etc. So let's do a quick exercise. Let's compare, in our minds, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and technology in similar terms. So, which is driving more of our day-to-day behavior today? Which is more profoundly influencing the ways in which we see the world and ourselves and our fellow human beings and providing a greater share of the stories we tell and we talk about? I mean, I could go on. One or two of these categories, religion might have a shot, but the tech industry would win every one. And tech really is winning. If you read the work of my friend James Williams, who is perhaps the most Neil Postman-like of today's tech critics. Williams grew up in a religious Christian family in the small city of Abilene in north central Texas, and went on to become an advertising strategist at Google. He won the Founders Award, Google's highest honor for its employees. But after several years at the giant company, which was famously founded on the motto, "Don't be evil," Williams began to feel troubled by his work. So James ultimately earned his PhD in the philosophy of technology ethics at Oxford, and recently won Cambridge University's prestigious $100,000 9 Dots Prize for creative thinking for his book Stand Out of Our Light, which argues, Digital technologies are threatening to rob us of what has now become the scarcest and most endangered resource in our modern economy: our ability to pay attention to what we want to pay attention to. He explains, for example, that the artificial intelligence that defeated the world champion at the strategy game Go is now being deployed for what purpose exactly? To keep us glued to our phones. Watching one YouTube clip or clicking on one link after another. You ever had that experience? Anybody? Most of us are not world champions, right? So at least when it comes to having the willpower to click or not click. And so we're losing. They're winning, we're losing. We're amusing ourselves to death. Now, what good are human beings, after all? And we're sort of in the business of human beings here. What good are human beings if we can't even decide for ourselves what to pay attention to? This is not a question which we had to contend with back when SHJ was founded, at least not with regard to digital tech. But think for a second here about Karl Marx's famous statement that religion was the opiate of the masses. Marx was calling religion the great distractor. That's what he's saying. He said, essentially, that it allowed people struggling to live meaningful, sustainable lives to repeatedly turn their attention away from politics or education or economic justice and towards something that made them feel better in the short term, right? By using the best cultural pyrotechnics available at the time. Does that sound familiar to you? Yeah, what I'm saying is that technology is currently playing a role in this day of the average citizens of our world similar to the role religions played in the lives of ancient and early modern people. Those are our people, the ones we want in this congregation. They are believers in the religion of technology. They don't know it. They wouldn't identify it that way, but that doesn't mean that's not what's happening. And by the way, religion pretended to have great power, in my judgment. Tech really does have power to give or end life on a breathtaking scale. Please don't make me go into all the dangers of AI weaponry or the tech that's fueling climate change or whatever it is. But I don't want to have to list them all. Now, today's young people are staring not only at their screens, but at climate change that threatens global order. They're staring at active shooter drills that expose our total inability to negotiate political progress on life or death issues. Despite every purported communications technology we could ever want. We've got the tech to communicate with one another, but coincidentally, we have no ability to communicate with one another, right? Okay, great. I'm going to stop now with this, I promise. Can we just do a double check? Did you invite me here to give a lecture on technology ethics? No. Okay, thank you. So I'm going on about this because I've gained some of the biggest insights of my career in humanism through the experience of starting to write a column on technology ethics for TechCrunch, which is the leading publication of what my editor calls the Silicon Valley elite. And I'm advising a group of Harvard College students who founded Harvard's first tech ethics journal. And I just want to say, these are the most secular people I've ever been around in my entire life. You heard earlier, I've done a lot of things, too many things, but I've never seen a group this secular. I mean, we're educators, political activists, anybody. These people assume atheism. Silicon Valley is a young atheist's world. I read one article, the headline in Vox.com recently, and it's really true. People are coming to me and to us for this topic at Harvard College more than I've ever seen before. I'm giving a talk next week for the Harvard College group of tech ethics students. And I titled it, If Tech Were a Religion, Would We Be Believers? and they had a lottery the session. I tell you that because I've been at Harvard for 15 years. The only way you would have put me and lottery and Harvard college students in the same sentence before is if I won the lottery and then I was giving away my ticket to whoever came to hear my talk. Okay? But this topic they cannot get enough of. Talking tech for these young people who, again, are mostly atheists is talking about the meaning of life. And so what I do is I ask the students to think of tech ethics not primarily as a set of questions about how to regulate Facebook or AI, but as an opportunity to ask the big questions of religion and humanism. So who are we? What are our values? What kind of society do we want to build? Where is our light? Here is our light. Look, these young people may not be joining our congregations by the thousands yet, but they're starting to recognize the need for mutual support. And that brings me to the final section of my talk. I want to talk about the work our movement has done through its congregations and the work that we're beginning to do as a cause. So we've explored this weekend that the Society for Humanistic Judaism was founded through the partnership of a group of experimental congregations. And Sherwin Wine was an iconoclast, but he was also a classically trained Reform rabbi, ditto Dan Friedman. Their training was build congregations. That's what they did, and they did it very well. And it was the best social technology available at the time for bringing Jews and others together. But technologies change. So I won't give a PowerPoint on congregations in America. I know you do not want that at this hour. But if the nuns are rising, what's shrinking? Congregational participation, congregational money, retention, etc. And by the way, even evangelical congregations these days, the last several years, plateauing at best. Now, I'm not saying stop building congregations. He said stop building congregations. No, I'm not saying that. If you are building a congregation and it is working, then keep going, please. It's wonderful, important work. Congregations make a huge difference for their members, and every SHJ congregation is a beacon of our values to its local area and to the world. And whatever you do, by the way, if you're building a congregation, support your clergy. Their job is hard. And your executive directors and everybody that's on your staff, you've got to support them, because if not, what are we even building? Okay. I am saying that there are new ways we can conceive of our extraordinary work together that do not rely on congregation building as their standard of excellence. Not some magic techie app like pieinthesky.com, but new social technologies. And that's why I got excited, Paul, when I first heard you talk about SHJ as a cause. So let me say what I think we mean by cause. And you don't have to mean what I mean, but cause is not the same as the cause, and by the cause I mean left-wing politics. I've actually become quite left-wing over the years. This suit can be washed and dried in a machine, by the way. I love it. And we should make space for plenty of socialists and socialism on our menu of topics and activities, but alternative views have to be welcomed. And we must remember, we're not the Democratic Socialists of America or the Center for American Progress. We're the Society for Humanistic Judaism. Second, a cause is, in my opinion, the right way to think about what we could be for millennials and Generation Zers whose friends, peers, and even families do not attend congregations. These people often are, however, active in many social causes. And whether you like it or not, they can also be obsessed, by the way, with identity politics. You ever heard about that? They live in this new world of radical diversity and pluralism, and so even if it sounds awkward or off-putting for our baby boomer or Gen X ears, why not meet them where they are and understand when we talk about ourselves in categories, black, LGBTQIA, indigenous, Latinx, disabled, whatever else, people are describing their experience as they have it. And humanistic Jew fits right into those categories. It's very convenient for us, actually. If we can educate young people to think about themselves as such, they might pick up our ball and run with it in directions we haven't imagined and in numbers we haven't imagined. Plenty of young people love, by the way, occasional inspiring rituals. So don't abandon rituals. We need to keep going with rituals, but they don't necessarily need to be 5 a week. And I've done 5 a week. They may even start, by the way, if we get them started, they may even start to complain that we don't do ritual often enough. Third and finally, I can't give you all the details of what SHJ is going to look like in 50 years, or even as a cause. That's the work of Paul and the work for everybody here to do together. But for me, a cause means reframing our main goal from providing a congregation to providing the opposite of loneliness. I learned that phrase, the opposite of loneliness, from one of my most gifted students. Marina was an undergraduate at Yale who approached me a decade ago to be her academic advisor for a summer-long project of traveling to India to study humanist communities there. She was obviously brilliant, and I was excited to say yes, in part selfishly because I thought she'd come back from the trip ready to be the best humanist community leader I'd ever seen and I'd ever mentored, and I was going to be so proud. Instead, she returned and explained compassionately, articulately, that the Indian humanist movement and its communities had not been as inspiring as she'd hoped, and she was planning to move on to other things. She's not going to be studying that anymore. She moved on to creative writing. And the good news is she went on to make the top 10, at least, of the New York Times bestseller list for her book of essays and plays, The Opposite of Loneliness, based on a sensational title essay, which has now had millions of readers, where she explained that what she really wanted her fellow Yale graduates to pursue in life was not quite community, and certainly not a congregation per se, but simply the kind of less formal togetherness and solidarity and mutual caring that you could call the opposite of loneliness. Now, the bad news is Marina raced so quickly to the top of the bestseller list posthumously. She was killed in a tragic car accident just after graduation, just weeks before she was due to start her new job at The New Yorker. Well, we know something about the tragedy of possibilities cut short around here, right? And while I would never compare my student, Marina, to my teacher, Sherwin Wine, in this case, I learned from the student, too. Maybe we don't need such formal structures for this next generation of leaders. Maybe that's not what they want. Maybe we can focus on educating and inspiring and supporting them. And if we do, just maybe they'll go out and do the same for more of their peers than we can imagine. That would be quite a change and quite an evolution. So for my part, I'm pleased to report that I'm enjoying the latest stage of my evolution. I'm sure there'll be 10 more. But for now, maybe my job writing these columns for TechCrunch is my congregation. In one recent column, I spoke to Douglas Rushkoff, the media theorist, techno-futurist, and humanistic Jew who might be the top tech ethicist alive today. And I want to end with some thoughts from that interview. Rushkoff's latest book is called Team Human, and in it he writes, "It's time we reassert the human agenda, and we must do so together. Not as individual players, as we've been led to imagine ourselves to be, but as the team human that we actually are." Emblazoned on the back of that bright red book in block yellow letters is the phrase, "Find the others." But I asked Rushkoff, and he doesn't mean that we should build congregations. He wants us to get educated about what it really means to be human so we can work together to push back against distraction, exploitative technologies, climate change, and more. Now, I still wasn't sure, though, about that point. And so I wanted to really ask him, and you can read up all about this in the column. I asked, what will this feel like? What's the emotional experience of being on Team Human? And he says to me, oh, we're waking up, he says. He continued, it's that both painful but delicious feeling when your foot wakes up after it was numb. Look at the sensation that's coming up. Oh, it's that being in a room of people where they take a pause. Just like, oh, isn't this great that we're all here together? Isn't it? And he took a long pause. Isn't it great to be brothers together? And then he laughed a deep belly laugh. You're a rabbi, Rushkoff said to me. Yes, I am. And then, in mid-interview, Douglas Rushkoff broke into spontaneous, unprompted, on-the-record song. And if you wouldn't mind, I'd like you to join me in singing the song that the world's greatest tech ethicist used to describe the feeling of being on Team Human together. And I won't even have to teach it. This is the melody I know best. Now just join me. With heart. You gotta sing with heart. Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. Hine ma tov u'manayim shevet achim gam yachad. If you guys, whatever you want. If we're done, we're done. Sure. All right, we got time? Whatever you want to do.
Any questions? I'll run the mic.
All right, sure. Yeah.
Now you've made me really dangerous. Hi, Rabbi Epstein. We introduced each other earlier today. I'm Ron Schwartz from the Deerfield congregation, Kol Hadash Humanistic Congregation. Rabbi Adam Shalom is our spiritual leader.
It is indeed.
The question, well, a comment and then a question. I agree that humanism is universal. The question I have for you is just one small part of your speech, and I loved your speech. Do you think some people, younger people, myself, can use tech as a means to an end as opposed to religion?
Yeah, so I'm working on this column. I call it tech agnostic. And the idea is tech's a religion. I'm an agnostic. I'm not an atheist. I'm not telling you to burn your phone. It might be cool, but I'm not sure what we'd come up with as the perfect alternative. I'm not a believer in all technology, and I'm not a total tech atheist. I think we need to bring our skepticism and our humanism and our investment in what is best for human beings to the tech world. And then we're going to have to argue it out together like we have to argue out everything else in humanism. Aren't we good at arguing? We can do this. All right. Yeah.
I sat here with bated breath. I was really excited. when you started to say, we really need to change.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that, you know, in your usual 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, you would tell us exactly how we need to change. And I would, if you don't mind, ask you to do that now.
Just when I try to get out, they pull me back in. Yeah. Part of it is I don't have all the answers to this. I mean, I would come here in my 20s and early 30s, and I would always have a theory to propose. I don't know. You know, I'll tell you some of the insights that I have, but I really didn't want to make my speech like a 10-point, this is what SHJ needs to do. Because it needs to let the new leaders figure it out. You're sitting next to somebody who's going to know. And she's going to know, by the way, much better because she's sitting next to you. And that's the model to me. But I've always said the music that we have in Jewish tradition and, you know, the last 100 years of Jewish tradition is an enormous resource for us. So, you know, I used to talk a lot about how the first few decades of Israeli music, what they did was, it was all of the, I did research on this for Harvard, all of the, or most of the leading songwriters and musicians of the early Israeli period were secular, and many of them told me in interviews, Naomi Shemer, the greatest Israeli songwriter of all time, her son, who's also a great musician, told me in an interview on record that she wrote her songs, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav and all these songs, as a secular and humanistic alternative to liturgy. And we still need to use that music more. That said, I think that the book that Miriam and others have been working on is a great step. It's a really nice resource, and it takes a lot to put that together. I know, I started working on something like that for us, you know, 17, 18 years ago, and that fell flat. But you did it, and that's going to be a big resource going forward. I would also say, you know, just to say a little bit more about this idea of the cause, right? That what I'm envisioning is you educate people that humanistic Judaism is your identity. And let me tell you what your identity contains. And you don't ask them to join a congregation, because they're not gonna, unless you get them to the point where now they're begging you, like, please give me a congregation to join, you know. But you educate, so what I think that means is that we just reframe some of our training and our messaging, and this will come up perhaps with the campaign that we're about to do. I think we reframe it as we do education so well. Some of our best programs are essentially just teach-ins. And so let's be honest about that. You know, rather than saying our goal is to be full congregations in every case, where therefore we're disappointing everybody from the gate, from the get-go, right? Because you have in your mind, congregation is a meeting every day, a meeting every week, a building, a rabbi, a this, a that. You know, so from the instant that we have contact with somebody, they are disappointed in us. Rather, we say what we are is we're in very large part an educational movement, a cause that you can join and support. Where I'm not disappointed in J Street or Greenpeace or Planned Parenthood because they don't have a rabbi and they don't meet 5 days a week. I'm not disappointed about that. So that's how we reframe it. And then the teaching that you already do, Eva, the writing that you already did that influenced me, and others in this room who do similar things, it will far exceed expectations. We just have to reframe what it is we say we're doing. That's my biggest suggestion.
Just a comment, not quite sure what to make of it, but it just popped into my head. Some of the most successful people in the tech world are putting billions of dollars into causes. Bill Gates, Elon Musk going to Mars, all of these kinds of things.
Yep.
So who can you hook us up with?
Yeah. I want. Oh, I can use that one. Yeah. So I want to say two things about that. One I'll talk in school, and one I'll talk out of school for a second. So on that, I do want to say I've become personally inspired by the work that some of my students or students that I work with have been doing, pushing back against the deification of the tech billionaire. Because I don't know about you, but I have spent a lot of time thinking, like, oh, these guys, they're gods, essentially, is how I treat them even, or how I have. And several months ago, as I was beginning to pick up this tech ethics thing, one of the students that I worked with that sought me out personally because she liked a tech ethics event that we did, said, read this book by a guy, Anand Giridharadas, who is a 37-year-old Indian-American journalist and author, who just wrote a book called Winners Take All, which is essentially an extraordinary takedown of the idea that billionaire philanthropists are what's right with the world. And he essentially says they are what is wrong with the world. And he basically says, I wish, he has the temerity to say, and I totally agree with him, and this is going to be counterintuitivity alert. He says, the world would be better off if Mark Zuckerberg had not given the money for the hospital that they built in his name in San Francisco, or for the city of Newark, or whatever it is, because it allowed him to hide behind that as a fig leaf the fact that his website is doing much more damage to the world, the way that it runs. So, yeah, like we'll network with some of these guys occasionally, but what I needed to do to take my tech ethics column at TechCrunch, the only reason I took it is because the editor that I work with has not said one peep to me since I joined about my view of ethics. I write about humanism and secularism in each piece. I write about what I want to write about. I critique Twitter. I critique Facebook. I critique all of these sites. And others like me do much better than I do at this, by the way. I mean, I'm just learning tech ethics criticism. There are amazing writers you could follow, and I try to retweet them all the time. But we can't just run around chasing after the billionaires, because guess what? They've got armies of people to keep you and me away from them. So it's not going to work. We have to critique them because they deserve the critique. And humanism is about calling out what deserves to be called out. Yeah.
I would agree with you that we have kind of a technocracy movement that not only is it overcoming our attention, but I think there's a myth that technology is going to save us. Mm-hmm. Now at this time, with climate change a product of technological overuse, we'll say, mm-hmm. or unconscious use, and nuclear proliferation, another technological miracle. Yep. That between that 1-2 punch, the very future of the species is at risk. Mm-hmm. So I would say...
What's the bad news?
Well, the point is, what can we do about it? How do you attract the non-affiliated? Mm-hmm. Is you take up the hard and difficult and maybe impossible task of trying to mitigate the effects of climate change, which they are very much aware and matters a lot to them. That's their future. Yep. And you take up the cause of nuclear controls. Even if that's difficult, if not impossible, you make it a cause that will attract.
Yeah, so let me respond to this directly. I believe that if we support young people, some of those people that we're supporting are going to be the next Greta in Europe, who's this hero for climate change. some of the people that we're going to support are going to be the next Emma Gonzalez, who isn't she an incredible hero, right? Emma Gonzalez is my hero. And by the way, her famous statement, right? No more thoughts, no more prayers. It's a perfect humanist slogan. When we support young people, they are going to be the next of those. But if we make our support for those young people contingent on them, join our congregation and we'll support you. Wah, wah. It's not going to work.
Any other questions? Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks a lot. That was a home run. Home run. That was really excellent.